So you look at the National Defense Strategy of the United States, which was published in January of this year. It lays out a vision for the world. And right now, the Americans are actually implementing this vision. The vision is this: America retreats into fortress North America. And that's why Trump has been aggressive towards Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, right? Because it's all part of Greater North America. And then what's going to happen is that the American economy is going to focus more on manufacturing and resource extraction. So the Pentagon has reached out to Ford and General Motors in Detroit and said that they would like these companies to manufacture more munitions and drones. And these companies are probably happy to do that because it's more profitable to make weapons than it is to make cars. So that's a vision for Greater North America. And in order to create markets for American weapons, what you do is you create divide and rule throughout the world, right? So imagine a situation where Russia is fighting Europe, Japan is fighting China in East Asia, Iran is fighting the GCC and Israel in the Middle East. Well, now the entire world depends on American resources and American weapons in order to sustain these wars. And this would be of tremendous benefit to America. So America right now is trying to create the conditions where the world is in complete chaos and America can just sit back in North America and profit, right? And that's why I think that when Trump goes to China, it's extremely conciliatory, where, he makes a lot of generous offers to China and China reciprocates. And so it seems there's now peace between China and the United States. But then what happens is that Trump goes immediately to Japan and encourages Japan to militarize against the Chinese threat. So what's happened is that before, the conflict was between the United States and Russia in Europe, and then the United States basically subcontract this conflict to the Europeans, right? And now before, the conflict was between China and the United States and East Asia. What the Americans are going to do is subcontract this conflict to the Japanese and the South Koreans against China. So it's all part of this, diabolical, cynical strategy of the Americans to maintain their empire. I completely agree with you. Like, this plan of the Americans is cynical, and it's also going to end up being counter-effective. It's going to destroy their allies, and it might turn the entire world against America. But the reality is that America is desperate to maintain its empire, and it's willing to burn down the entire world in order to maintain its empire. So that's the situation we are in. I also point out that if you look at the battle lines in Ukraine, I believe the European special forces are already in the battle. So last year, it seemed as though the Russians had a major breakthrough, and it seemed as though the Ukrainian front lines were exhausted. They basically broke down. And now there's a certain new energy to the Ukrainian front lines, and they're winning back territory. So I have to believe that European special forces are already on the ground in some capacity in Ukraine. Because of mission creep, we should expect an escalation. And also, the Ukrainians are striking at Russian oil refineries. And this is going to compel the Russians to hit the Ukrainians much harder. The Russians have been extremely methodical in their attacks against Ukrainians. They've not targeted Ukrainian power plants. They've not targeted critical civilian infrastructure. And now they will, because they appreciate that this war will not be between Europe and Russia. And it'll be fight to the bitter end. The entire U.S. strategy is for Europe to fight the last European, as you say, and they'll sit this out because they have absolutely no interest. All they want to do is cause as much conflict in the world as possible and then continue to sell weapons and resources to Europe, and they will finance it and thus force the world to absorb U.S. debt. It's very clear what's happening. Even the Europeans know what's happening. But unfortunately, the entire European leadership has been vassalized by the Americans, and the European leadership is very much afraid of their own population. These are bureaucrats who just want to maintain power. It's going to basically take a popular revolt for policy to change in Europe. Unfortunately, the Chinese can have a very short-term, utilitarian approach to geopolitics. So what we need to recognize is that the Chinese have strong economic relations with everyone in the Middle East, including Israel, including the GCC, including Iran. So they don't want to be put in a situation where they side with Iran and then they are forced in a conflict with the GCC. The Chinese don't do things like that. They believe very much in balance and harmony. So the Chinese have been applying a lot of pressure on the Iranians to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to basically end this war as much as possible. Now, it's completely unfair because it's Americans and it's really to the aggressor. But unfortunately, you can't reason with bullies. You can't reason with thugs. So the Chinese are stuck trying to reason with the Iranians. So the Chinese basically want this war to end as soon as possible and for global trade to resume as peacefully as possible. But unfortunately, the Chinese are not taking a long-term geopolitical approach to the situation in the Middle East. They don't really acknowledge the fact that the Americans are hell-bent on maintaining their empire. And in the long term, it's not really in the benefit of China to side with the Americans. But in the short term, the Chinese are stuck working with the Americans. Look, at the end of the day, the American empire is able to control Trump. And Trump is a chaos agent, but he is doing the bidding of the American empire. But if you actually read the national security strategy, you just think about game theory and how the Americans benefit from all that's going on, everything Trump is doing makes sense. Why Trump is important is Trump is willing to do these things. Biden was to do these things, but he didn't do these things because he was afraid of looking like a complete idiot. And so it's actually very hard to find someone like Trump who's willing to be the bad guy, who's willing to be the scapegoat. So remember back 2003 during the war against Iraq, everyone knew it was about oil. Everyone knew about the American empire. And you had protests all around the world against this act of aggression against Iraq. But now in this blatant act of aggression against Iran, you don't have protests around the world. Everyone's, focused on Trump and thinking that, if Trump would be gone in 2 years' time, and then the world will return back to normal. So Trump is extremely useful for the purposes of American empire because the American empire needs certain things to happen, including a national draft. So the reality is that for the past few years, America has been trying to onshore manufacturing back from China. And there's a really good reason why it doesn't work, because the American population has become complacent. It's become lazy and corrupt. Think about all these American young people who are trying to make their fortunes trading cryptocurrency or gambling online and spend all their time on OnlyFans. I mean, the empire has made America an extremely corrupt and lazy place where young people aren't able to contribute effectively to the economy. The problem isn't the lack of manufacturing jobs. There are lots of manufacturing jobs in America. The problem is you don't have young people in America who want to work these blue-collar jobs. They don't want to work for $10 an hour. They much rather, gamble and try to make $1 million in a year. So you need a national draft, not to fight wars, but to discipline your population, to train your population to be much more compliant, to be much more desperate, and to have real skills. That's the reason why you need a national draft. And don't forget this, Clinton in 1992, when he was running for the presidency, he was a Bernie Sanders Democrat. He was anti-free trade, he was anti-NAFTA. And then when he came to power, he became a neoliberal. He was more conservative, more pro-business than even the Republicans. So it doesn't really matter who you elect, the empire is still going to be in charge. I think for the next year, it will seem as though the Americans are winning. Trump's going to go to China, and eventually China and the United States will come to an agreement that's going to look very good for America. And Chinese are going to agree to buy up more US debt. And this war in Iran, even though in the long term America's going to lose this war, in the short term, the Americans are going to be able to inflict tremendous damage on the Iranians, especially economically. So in the short term, it will look as though the American empire is winning. But in the mid to long term, we know exactly what happens in these situations, which is the empire breaks out into civil war. Just look at any history. Empires in decline have many characteristics: corruption, decadence, low fertility rates, mass immigration. And then two very common symptoms of an empire decline are: one, wars overseas, and two, civil wars. So if Trump seeks a third term, this is going to ignite a civil war in America between two major factions. You have the Wall Street financiers who have been in control of America since the Clinton years, basically. And then you have the tech oligarchs, people like Larry Ellison, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel, who are trying to displace the financiers and control Washington, D.C. in order to create an AI surveillance state that would benefit them. And Trump is very much their agent in this cause. And so how civil war would start is that these two different factions would finance different opposition groups, and these opposition groups would have militias on the ground, creating as much civil chaos as possible. And so if Trump were to get a third term, you can expect that there will be a lot of political violence throughout America in his third term. So the main characteristic of American imperial decline is hubris, right? Where Washington, D.C. has become a bubble, and it's impossible to reason with anyone in this bubble. So remember back in Trump's first term, and I think in Trump's first term, he's very much MAGA. He very much wanted to end these wars overseas, and he wanted to build a wall in Mexico to stop immigration. What happened was the entire American media started to attack him. His own cabinet leaked unflattering information about Trump. American generals refused to follow Trump's orders. Trump ordered a withdrawal from Syria. They ignored him. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, called the Chinese and told the Chinese, ignore this guy, he's not in charge. That's treason. There was the Russiagate hoax, where they insisted that this guy was agent of Putin. And they had this huge investigation. A former FBI director, Robert Mueller, was forced to exonerate Trump. So the first term, it was all Washington, D.C. was trying to destroy Trump. January 6th seemed as a deep state conspiracy to impeach him, to make sure he can never run for president again. So that's what happens in Washington, D.C. If you try to defy the empire, they will find every way to destroy you. The United States invaded Iran because it has no choice in the matter. If it were not to invade Iran, it would lose its empire. Its empire is based purely on the US dollar, the petrodollar, which is a Ponzi scheme. If it did not invade Iran, then people would choose not to trade with it anymore. People would choose to not buy US treasuries. For the longest time, this system worked fine. But then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. That was not the issue. The issue was the American response. The American response was to sanction Russia and remove Russia from the SWIFT global payment system. It also ordered Europeans to freeze over $200 billion in Russian assets. And this is a problem because the very basis for having the US dollar as the global reserve currency is that it would remain politically neutral. The Americans guaranteed seamless, politically neutral international exchange. So if this trend continues, if you don't do anything about Russia, Russia would take over Ukraine. And Russia then would build an alliance with China and Iran. If you look at these three countries on a map, this is the entire Asian continent. And then what they can do is this. They can say, okay, the United States is a bully. They force us to play by the rules. They get very angry if we don't play by the rules. So let's not play with the United States anymore. Let's just trade amongst ourselves. And then what they can do is they can build a Eurasian railway system connecting Russia, Iran, and China together. And then what this would do is negate American sea power because it's American ships that patrol and protect the oceans. And then what would happen is the world, Europe, Middle East, Africa, India, East Asia, would look at this trading bloc and think to themselves, wow, these guys, the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese, they use gold as their medium of exchange. Gold is valuable. The Americans, on the other hand, use US dollars as the medium of exchange, which is not valuable. So am I better off with the American system or with this new BRICS system? So by attacking Iran, the first thing that happened is that China is now cut off from Middle East energy. China receives anywhere between 50 to 6% of its energy needs from the Middle East. Not just Iran, but also Qatar and Saudi Arabia. A lot of people say that China today, it's reliant on renewables, solar, wind, and that's true to a certain extent. But remember that China, it is an industrial powerhouse. So it needs energy from everywhere and everyone. So the fact that China is losing all this energy from the Middle East presents China with a long-term strategic vulnerability. And that's the first thing that happens. Second thing that happens is that Europe is in a lot of trouble. Because remember, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian energy was sanctioned. And so Europe relied more on the Middle East for its energy needs, especially Qatar. And now Europe has lost all of this oil. And then you have Japan and South Korea are also reliant on the Middle East for its energy. So now the question is, if you're not getting your energy from the Middle East, where can you get your energy from? And there's only two answers, either Russia or the United States. Russia is at war. And what's happening is the Ukrainian drones are attacking Russian oil refineries and export hubs. So the world in the short term has no choice but to look to America for its energy needs. And what did Trump do recently? He took over Venezuela, which has the world's greatest oil reserves. He's threatening Canada. He's threatening Greenland, Mexico, Colombia. If Trump controls the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire world has to beg Trump for energy and resources. And this saves both the US dollar as well as the American empire. The American society does not have the political will, does not have manufacturing capacity, and does not have the risk tolerance to fight this war in Iran. Basically, America wants to fight this war as cheaply, as easily, and as quickly as possible, right? So Trump really thought that, if I sent my airplanes to strike Tehran and kill the Ayatollah, they would just surrender. He paid no attention to the culture. He paid no attention to the history of the Iranian people. He had absolutely no respect for the nation. And when you do that, when you underestimate your opponent, when you yourself are not willing to commit to the fight, you're going to lose. On January 3rd of this year, Delta Force went into Venezuela, kidnapped Maduro, and they completely surrendered. So in Trump's mind, he wants to replay the Venezuela scenario. He is a reality TV star. He thinks in terms of optics. He doesn't think in terms of like geopolitical strategy. The American military has become a very corrupt and insular institution that is trying to generate as much congressional funding as possible in order to fund the military-industrial complex. So that's what a lot of people say, that Trump's stupid, that he was misled by the Israelis, and there's good evidence to support this. But I want to show you something. It's called the National Defense Strategy. It explains what the American strategy to maintain global dominance is. And in the introduction, what it says is that for too long, America has been bullied by the world. America is a nation that protects the world, yet Europe, East Asia takes advantage of American generosity. The Europeans don't pay for their defense, and so they put all this money into welfare, into their pension system. The Chinese have been giving America a bad trade deal. The Chinese steal American technology and then use it to make products that they sell back to the Americans. So the Americans have been getting a really bad deal for decades. And President Donald Trump, he's going to change that by doing 4 things. The first thing that America is going to do is going to secure the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, you cannot trade with any of these countries without American permission, without paying a tribute to the Americans. This is why the Americans have parked 1/3 of their naval assets in the Caribbean today to tell the Chinese and the Russians, back off. You want to come here, you either pay a tribute or you'll be attacked. Okay, that's the first point of this strategy. The Western Hemisphere belongs to America, something that they call the Monroe Doctrine, okay, which is Trump's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Point 2 is that America wants to reimagine its relationship with its allies. Basically, NATO needs to pay for its own defense. NATO needs to go fight Russia in Ukraine. America will provide support, it'll provide weapons and financing, but NATO needs to do more work. And in East Asia, South Korea and Japan need to do a better job of keeping China in check. Point 3 is specific to China. And the idea is the United States does not want to destroy China, but China needs to be put in its place. China needs to respect the power and the reach of the United States. And how the United States is going to do this is by strangling China economically. So if you look at a map of China, most of its trade goes through something called the Strait of Malacca. And the Strait of Malacca is the most important maritime choke point in the world. All America has to do is park naval carriers inside the Strait of Malacca, and China will lose 90% of its energy exports. So America has something called the first island chain, okay? And the first island chain prevents China from reaching the Pacific Ocean. The first island chain includes South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Malaysia. That blocks China from reaching out into the Pacific. So in order for it to access trade, it has to go through the Strait of Malacca. And through the Strait of Malacca, it can access India, Africa, and the Middle East. And so by positioning naval carriers inside the Strait of Malacca, it creates a blockade, and China would have to pay a toll in order to access the Strait of Malacca. And the fourth one is to reinvigorate America's defense manufacturing sector. So what this means is that the Pentagon a few weeks ago went to Detroit and talked to Ford and General Motors and said, you know what, because of this war in Iran, we might need you to stop making cars and start making more munitions. And they're happy doing this because the profit margins are much greater for weapons than for cars. This is the Pentagon, so you can charge them as much as you want and they'll pay for it. Whereas you make cars, it's for the consumer market and they may not buy your cars. So if you're like Ford or General Motors, the best deal in the world is to go make weapons for the Pentagon to fight these wars in the Middle East that can go on for forever. So we have a situation where, okay, look, if you read the news, if you talk to a lot of people, Trump's an idiot. And this war in Iran makes no sense at all. But then if you just read the national defense strategy, it's a very clear roadmap of what America needs to do in order to maintain imperial hegemony. And so let's just summarize the major points. The first major point is to maintain control over the Western Hemisphere and create a fortress America. Look at all the countries that he's named over the past year. Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, Nicaragua, Honduras. It's all the Western Hemisphere. Second point is to create divide and rule all around the world. So imagine a situation where in Europe, NATO fights Russia in Ukraine. In East Asia, China fights South Korea and Japan. In the Middle East, Iran fights the GCC allied with Israel. What does America do? America can now sell everyone weapons and resources and finance it. This would be back to World War II. And then what would happen is that $40 trillion that America has in debt, it would disappear because it would be absorbed by the world. So you can say, look, Trump's an idiot, but if you actually look at a map and how America wants this world map to play out, it makes perfect sense. So you can say the war is going very well for Trump. Losing the war means that America would send ground troops, Iran would survive this ground invasion, and this would be so politically damaging that chaos breaks out in the United States, and the U.S. ground invasion is forced to retreat, and the United States is forced to retreat from the Middle East. America doesn't really care about this war in Iran because what America wants to do is force the entire world to become dependent on American weapons and resources. And you do that in two ways. The first is you control the strategic choke points of the world, and they include the Strait of Hormuz. You also want to control the Panama Canal. You also want to control Greenland. You also want to control the Strait of Gibraltar. At the same time, you want to use your technological supremacy, your aerial supremacy, your drones, to destroy the world's critical energy infrastructure. Already, we're seeing oil refineries being destroyed throughout the world. As America, you're trying to deplete the world's energy inventory, so they're forced to beg you to supply energy. And once this market is created, then you can build infrastructure for Venezuela. You can take over Canada. You can control Mexico. You can take over Greenland, okay? The Russians have no choice but to respond, because if Americans are controlling the strategic choke points, your shuttle fleet is rendered redundant, useless. So how do you ship your oil around the world? Well, you have two options. I'm just going to build railways to unite the Eurasian continent. The problem with that is now that you're vulnerable to American aerial supremacy, drone attacks. So you have no choice but to arm your shuttle fleet. And now what's going to happen is this conflict in the oceans between Russian shuttle fleet tankers that are trying to transport oil around the world and these American destroyers who are trying to capture or destroy these shuttle tankers. Now, the advantage that Russia has is that America doesn't have that much naval assets anymore. The other thing is that the world really needs energy. So you can imagine China financing the militarization of the Russian shuttle fleet. Iranian tankers have been seized by the Americans, and tankers are being seized in the Caribbean as well by the American Navy. I believe they are Russian tankers. And as you point out, this is an act of war, right? So what the United States is doing is slowly expanding its global reach. And the way it's doing that is by signing treaties with nations that are part of these choke points. So the Strait of Malacca, recently the United States has signed a military cooperation agreement with Indonesia. And with the Strait of Gibraltar, the Americans have signed an agreement now with Morocco, right? So they're looking for the legal framework, and justification to control the world's choke points, which would bring them directly in conflict with the Russian shuttle fleet. I think we're already in the catalyst moment. I think we're already in World War III, because this conflict, it's going to expand outwards into a global conflict, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop this, right? Because again, you have these different competing visions of how the world should work, and the Russians and Americans are already at conflict with each other. So the next step will be the Russians come into this war on the side of the Iranians. Because according to Russian grand strategy, you have no choice but to save the Iranians, because you're trying to promote this view that the world is split between the spiritual and the material. The Americans are the Antichrist. The Americans support individual hedonism, whereas we Russians, we believe in humanity. We believe in goodness. We believe in community, right? So if that is your argument, if that's your grand strategy, then you have a moral obligation, a moral imperative to help the Iranians in their time of need.